And Frida, we are live.
Welcome to this live stream panel on the state of the Sudanese and Algerian uprisings. I am Frida Afari from the Alliance of Middle Eastern Socialists.
And I'm Brian Bean from the Chicago Socialists.
We will be moderating today's panel. This event is sponsored by Al-Manshur, online publication of the Revolutionary Socialist Organization, the Socialist Forum, the Alliance of Middle Eastern Socialists, the Socialism Conference, Middle East and North Africa Solidarity Network, Socialist Alternative Red Flag, Revolutionary Socialism in the 21st Century, RS21, New Politics Magazine, and the Democratic Socialists of America's International Committee. First, we will introduce the panelists, then we will have a 1-hour-long question and answer period directed by the moderators. The last half hour of the program will take up questions from audience members who will have a chance to submit their questions via Facebook. Our panelists today are the following. Sarah Abbas is a doctoral candidate in political science and a feminist who researches social movements in Sudan. She has written for Transition Magazine, Open Democracy, and The Nation. The views expressed are her own and do not represent those of institutions she's affiliated with. Adam Bahar is a Sudanese human rights activist based in Berlin. He is also a member of Justice Equality Movement Sudan. Selma Omari is an Algerian French member of the New Anti-Capitalists in France. He is involved in anti-racist struggles as well as international solidarity. Hamza Hamouchen is a London-based Algerian scholar activist, commentator, researcher, and a founding member of Algeria Solidarity Campaign and Environmental Justice North Africa.
Thanks, Frida. And Selma, you just joined us. If you could mute when you're not talking, that would be fantastic. But thanks for joining us. As Frida mentioned, the format of the program is we have about 10 questions that the moderators are going to pose to the panelists. One person from each region will be responding to it, but the other person can also weigh in and add some if they wish, just to try to make sure we have time to get in all the questions and questions from the internet. I will let respondents know when they've talked for about 4 minutes. That's not like a cutoff. It's just so you can sort of gauge yourself and know how much time you're spending. So after an hour of questions, we'll hope to have about 30 minutes for questions from the audience. And so if you're listening via Facebook or YouTube, in the comments, put your question. We have some people there who are gathering them and compiling them, and we'll try to get to them in the last 30 minutes of our event. And so now we'll get started. And Frida, you're going to ask the first question.
Thank you. Can you give us some historical and current background on how each uprising started? How are these uprisings in continuity and discontinuity with what became known as the Arab Spring in 2011? Sarah?
Sorry, yeah, I wasn't sure if I'm the one who's starting. Thank you. Thank you so much, Frida and Brian, and thank you to all the organizations that are co-sponsoring and everyone who is involved in making this happen. In terms of Sudan, the uprising started on December 13th, 2018, so about 6 months ago now. The uprising started through protests that began in the town of Ad-Damazin in Blue Nile State. It's one of the war-affected regions of the country. It then moved on to Atbara, which is also a town in Sudan further away that is a sort of historical center of the labor movement in Sudan. And from there, the protests spread to many other cities as well as Khartoum, which is the capital of Sudan. The protests essentially continued and were brutally repressed by the regime. This is not the first time, of course. The regime had been in power since 1989, so for close to 3 decades. On April 6, an organization that had kind of risen to leadership within the protest, the Sudanese Professionals Association, which is an alliance of unions, of civil society organizations, and so forth, that was actually banned by the regime, organized a million march. People marched in different cities, including in Khartoum, and managed to break through to the area in front of the military general command. Now, this is really important because the regime in Sudan was an Islamist military regime. So the military has been in power since 1989. It has, of course, also been mostly in power at different periods since Sudan's independence in 1956. On April, having made their way to the area in front of the military general command, people have been actually holding a sitting there and in other cities in different parts of the country since that time, which led to the fall of Omar Hassan al-Bashir, the president of Sudan, on April 11th. He was replaced by another military leader who had to step down the day after because he was rejected as well as being a member of the regime. And since then, the sittings and the civil disobedience, which has been peaceful, that has been one of the most important principles of the uprising, have continued with negotiations stopping and starting, with the main demand being the handover of power to a civilian administration that would have a transitional period in Sudan and deal with several issues which we can talk about later. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And Hamza?
First of all, thank you for hosting this event. I'm happy to be participating in it. Just to start with the current background, the mass protest movement that has begun just a few days after Abdelaziz Bouteflika's announcement of his intention to run for a 5th term as president. What started as a rejection of the candidacy of a physically unfit octogenarian president has transformed in face of the obstinacy and deceptive ploys of the ruling elites into a united rejection of the ruling system with demands of radical democratic change, freedom, and social justice. In a way, this revolt is an expression of the convergence of the popular discontent from below with the deep internal crisis within the ruling classes. When it comes to the historical background, there is a lot of things to say, but I'll try to be brief. First of all, it is important to note that this eruption of popular anger is the result of the accumulation of struggles and acts of resistance that go back to the early 80s. The most recent examples being the anti-shale uprisings in 2015, the labor mobilizations, especially in the teaching sector in 2011, 2012, and the unemployed movement since 2012 in the Algerian Sahara. The second point is that the country has been experiencing a political crisis for decades, in particular since the 1992 military coup and the ensuing brutal war against civilians. More than 2,000 people died and tens of thousands of people disappeared in that war. The Algerian generals then were isolated internationally. It's them who brought Bouteflika in 1999 to rehabilitate them somehow. Third, the causes of the revolt are fundamentally economic and are the result of more than 3 decades of neoliberal restructuring and parasitic accumulation through oil and gas rent by a military oligarchical nexus. The Bouteflika era has been the most ultra-liberal era in Algeria's history. We've seen the setting up of companies, deindustrialization, huge concessions made to multinationals, and setting up a sort of an import-import bazaar economy. When you have the oil prices high, this allows for buying social peace. When they fall down, as was the case since 2016, this leads to crippling austerity measures, pauperizations, and growing unemployment. When it comes to your questions about the Arab Spring, the Algerian slogan, "الشعب يريد يتنحى," which means the people want them all to go, is just another version of "الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام," which means the people want to overthrow the system. The slogan we've seen during the Arab uprisings of 2011. In this respect, what is happening, I think, in Algeria and Sudan today is the continuation of this protracted revolutionary process. The hope is that the revolutionary forces in both these countries learn from the experiences of their brothers and sisters in other countries and push the revolutions even further. Stop here.
Great, thanks. So the second question is asking if you could just tell us, what do the uprisings look like on the ground? Could you sort of paint a picture of the current protest movements? What's the arrangement of forces and how does it look? What is the experience like? And then I think specifically in the situation of Sudan, to say more about what happened during the 2-day general strike that took place in Sudan. I know many of us on the left were looking at that very curiously and hopeful. So what does it look like on the ground? And I think we're going to take Adam first.
Yeah, thank you for having me here. I will try also a little bit to go back, I think, because it's also how it is now, the protests look like also have to do with what Sarah said already, that in 6th of April 2019, they calling for 1 million march, and this 1 million march somehow reach in Khartoum, especially I'm talking about Khartoum now, he reaching the front of the army buildings, and there people have this sit-in since the 6th of April. In the same times, also in other different city in Sudan, also there is people who also reach the military building in different city, and also they have their own sit in front of these different cities. That showing that this protest was before, it's like long time of doing different kind of actions, but now since the 6th of April, they have this main symbol of sitting in front of the army's buildings. In this area, you can see in the last time, there is a kind of powerful, artistical, and it's like a kind of daily workshop talking about politics and different things in this place, taking also place not only in the Khartoum, it's also in other different cities. It is coming for some people, it's like the part of life. There's families and children, and so they coming sometimes in evening also to have some music and be with the people, and sometimes also like Friday time where people pray in Friday. In Sudan, for example, this was a big event all the time taking place as the biggest place where the people have their Friday praying there. Then it is kind of special revolution society have been taking place in this area since 6th of April. Regarding to the next question of what is the forces in the ground have, I think it is also important to say in Sudan. In the first, this kind of labor's union, Sudan SPA, Sudanese Professional Association, was engaging of organizing and arranging the call for the demo in the Facebook, and so they had in the 1st of January 2019, they have one paper, they bring it out and they call the people to sign it. It's called the paper of the change and freedom, and there is written how they need to change in the political situation in Sudan, what they need to have in this period of time before the election is coming, and so on. There's a different civil societies, organization, and also opposition parties and different organizations who sign this paper, and they agree to work together to have this revolution. Then the forces all in the ground now, they have this ground, they accept all this paper of change and freedom, and they work together to achieve this. What is written in this, it is more important just to say that the first thing is to change this government, and the second thing is to have this 4 years transition government before the elections. And now in the last time, there was this negotiation between delegation of the opposition party and the people who signed this paper and the ruling army now, and they reach some point, but still some point open, but still this paper of freedom and change, it is the main paper who all the people agree to have it and sign it. I will just also continue about these 2 days of general strike. I think it was also one message that people try to show after this negotiation. What I talked about it before I mentioned it, it was stuck in one point, and they try to go back again and do something and show that the revolution is still strong and people have their own opinion and they can do more, and that's why they come these 2 days of general strike. It was really successful. A lot of people say it is more than 90% was participating from the different part of the whole society. Especially we had like big institution was also part of it, and it's like the main bank in Sudan, the people was there, they get in the strike, and so even in the airport, people also taking the strike. There is more airplanes, like 2-3 airplanes coming from different other countries, from Saudi Arabia, from Egypt, and so they stopped and they cannot reach Sudan in these days. It was a really powerful strike in the days, and it's also kind of training and preparation for long general strike without ending if the thing is not going in the way of giving the people the whole freedom they demand. Small things again I would like to say about it, because also I think people talk about Arab Spring and try to connect it so much also about what's going on now in Sudan. I think we had small things to say about that, because we think we had also more experience in Sudan about revolution, because Sudan have done already 2 revolutions before who never it never be somehow said in different way, because in 1946 and in 1958 Sudan was happening 2 revolution. And I think if we look to the way of revolution in Sudan now going on, we can say Sudan has learned from his own experience. It does not mean that we don't learn about the Arab Spring in 2011, but we think it is, especially for my point of view, is not continue and parting of Arab Spring. For us, it's more about also learning from our experience and going forward about it. And for me, that can be point of discussion. We can talk about it later, but that's just what I need to mention. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Hamza, I believe you're next.
Yes. So the mobilizations at first were small and localized, but they became massive afterwards, especially starting from 22nd of February. And starting from that date and every Friday, including in Ramadan and under the heat, millions of young and old men and women from different social classes have taken to the streets in an inspiring uprising, reappropriating the long confiscated public spaces. Those historic Friday marches have been followed by other protests by workers in education, health, justice systems, by other trade union mobilizations, and by students making this contestation a daily matter. What makes this movement really unique, in my view, is its massive scale, its peaceful character, and the national spread, including in the marginalized South. One can also see this uprising as the continuation of the anti-colonial struggle of the 50s and 60s to regain popular and economic sovereignty. Because many references have been made in the protests and marches to the anti-colonial revolution, reaffirming that formal independence has no meaning without popular sovereignty. And these anti-colonial sentiments have been reinforced by staunch hostility to foreign interference and imperialist intervention. We have also seen the unshakable solidarity with Palestinians and in the permanent presence of the Palestinian flag alongside the Algerian one. I think Algerians understand that their liberation won't be complete with the liberation of Palestine. And this is, I think, a unique feature in the Arab world and can be explained by the fact that Algeria and Palestine are being the only countries in the region that experience racist and genocidal settler colonialism. Other characteristics of the movement is that it is youth-led and relatively loose. There are no clearly identifiable leaders or organized structures that are propelling it. It is pluralistic, popular uprising, mobilizing forces from the middle classes and from the marginalized classes in urban and rural areas. And unlike Sudan, where the Sudanese Professional Association is playing a leading and organizing role, in Algeria it looks like things are getting organized horizontally and mainly through social media. And I'd like also to say something about the radical evolution of slogans and demands in the last 3 months. It started at first with a narrow rejection of the 5th term of Bouteflika. And then it went to they must all go, to the recent we want a civilian, not a military state. Algeria is a republic, not a military barrack, signaling a possible confrontation with the military high command very soon. And finally, democratic rights as well as individual and collective rights of freedoms have not been achieved as yet, as the repression of protests is still ongoing, and there are still many political prisoners. We have been reminded of this dismal reality with this week's death of Kamal al-Din Khar, a human rights activist, following 50-day hunger strike. Thank you.
Great.
Thank
Frida?
you, Hamza. Women have had a prominent role in both uprisings. How are women participants and feminist organizations challenging patriarchy?
So I guess I will answer this question first. I just wanted to go back very, very briefly to something that Adam said in relation to the Arab Spring, and I think it also relates to this issue of women's role in the protests in Sudan, sort of historically as well as today. I also share that view with Adam that there are definitely ways in which you can see the lessons that have been learned in the Arab Spring reflected in the current uprising in Sudan. And of course, the primary lesson being that you should not leave the streets too soon. So that the only guarantee that you have in a popular uprising of this nature is to remain on the street and to remain mobilized and to defend the revolution until its goals and its missions have been met. So, returning to your question, I think women have been central actually to this uprising in Sudan. It's something that actually is very, for someone like myself that has been sort of looking at the history of social movements in Sudan, I can see a continuity with the past in the sense that, as Adam mentioned, we've had 2 uprisings in the past that have resulted in the fall of military regimes. Both were peaceful civil society and popular uprisings in 1964 and 1985, in both of which women played a prominent part. But the extent and the level of leadership and the sheer numbers of women's involvements in the protests in this uprising are unprecedented. And I would argue that it represents a social revolution, not just a political revolution. It's changing the way that women's involvement in politics is actually perceived in the society. And you can see it reflected in the main demands actually from the street of the revolution, which is essentially one of the main demands in the Declaration for Freedom and Change, which is the basis of this anticipated transition, is an end to all discrimination and all forms of discrimination against women and the promotion of women's rights. So we see that as being a core demand of the revolution, and that is largely due to the role of women. I would also argue that women's leadership is not coming out of a vacuum. It's coming out of this historical involvement of women in civil society and in movements and social movements in Sudan, but also this regime has particularly targeted women. So this regime, as part of it, what it called the civilizational project, its conception of a state building project, has very much targeted women as essentially a sector that needs to be controlled, and to control them by different means. One of them is the legal means. For example, we have public order laws that sought to control how women dress and how they, in which parts of the public sphere they are allowed to be, but also the wars that the Bashir regime had carried out in different parts of the country. One of its main victims has been women. So women have been targeted through all sorts of in different ways, from rape to bombings. Sudan, of course, had one of the highest populations of internally displaced people in the world, many of whom are women and children. So you could see that the state had exercised violence in many different ways against women. And so women are very much on the street, and they're very much in the organizations, in the sort of volunteer organizations that are the basis on the street of maintaining this sort of 24/7 presence on the street, but also they are part of organizations like the Sudan Professionals Association and workers' organizations that are also part of trying to already deal with these issues of corruption, of transitional justice, of dealing with the legacy of this regime and dealing with the economic collapse that has affected women disproportionately. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's my turn to answer on the points. First of all, women has been very much present and very active in demonstration, in the current demonstration. In Algeria happening there, and they also, some of them organized themselves as feminist, not just as in solidarity within the general movement, but also to reclaim equal rights towards men. And this has raised also debates within the movement, within the people who were part of the demonstrations. And this beginning of self-assertion of women's rights within the demonstrations and the debates all around really looks like the situation in Sudan, in which the famous slogan "Sawt al-mar'a thawra," women's voice, women's raising their voice is revolution, in response to the common expression saying that women's voice are failure. That was the way it was raised from what I see in Sudan. It's the same issue here. You have also in the demonstrations women raising their voice to demand equal rights. And the other thing Hamza pointed out is that there is a economic issue, and women are central, are the ones who are the most marginalized economically. So so this movement, within this movement, you have the question of economic sovereignty, but also about women's right to work. When you see the percentage of the labor force today in Algeria is 18% of women who can work, which means that they are the ones who are the most, I would say, marginalized and from getting a job. So, which means that more than 82% of men can work, and 18% of women work. So the whole rest is not working, which means that they are dependent, very much dependent economically. And at the same time, it's not just a movement erupting just like this. There is a legacy of feminism within the Algerian history. First of all, the Algerian War of Independence, in which many of you have seen women play the prominent role, because France wanted to play over the fact that, Algerian people are very backwarded for women's rights. And actually, the independence movement were the one who were at the forefront for women's rights. And till today, you have revolutionary figures like Jamila Bouhired, who was a national figure today in Algeria. She stand up in solidarity with the current movement against the army. And it's a very important symbol. It's interesting to see that those, I would say, people who still kept some kind of integrity towards the revolutionary legacy are women. And the other thing is that not just from this founding historical points in which women have more reasons for independence than men, I would say, feminist movement has been also very much challenged in the recent years when the neoliberal, I would say, turn happened in the early 80s. At the same time, in a way to, I would say, control women's, the family code was settled, which means that women are minors and have not their own independence. And so since that those years, women has been fighting over getting equal rights towards men. They're also fighting against harassment, street harassment. So it's not just happening today. It's also the fact that women now, new generations of women can stand up is because the previous generation also fight for those rights. And just to finish about it fastly, I would say, like, yes, one of those challenges regarding the situation globally is the use of women's dress code, like already in during the independence war, France colonial rule said that, the veil is backwarded and women have to dress like, occidentally, etc. So this was I would say, a trap in which sometimes when Algeria was independent was in it. For example, still you have this, opposition between either veiled women are seen as backwarded or seen as agents of political Islam, or seen as good people, in contrast to the ones who are not dressing the hijab. Those one who are dressing with the hijab was always, categorized politically, and it's a real trap. So the civil war, the current civil war, was also an instrumentalization of the political Islam towards women who are wearing the veil, saying that it's what everybody should do. And the opposite is the modernists, I would say, who were close to the army as well, saying that veiled women are a threat, and we should, liberation of women means that we have to be anti-hijab. So this was a trap in which in which feminist debate were in during the 80s, 90s, and the Civil War. But since the end of the Civil War, it has this situation has radically changed with mutual acceptance among women in general. So there was a revival in the early 2000s of the feminist movement, which allowed reconciliation and the end of instrumentalization of women's dressing for political purposes. And so this allowed kind of, I would say, this allowed some kind of unity among women. I just conclude, sorry. And that's the movement that we are seeing now on the street, which is helpful.
Excellent.
Thank you, Soma and Sarah.
Thank you. So another feature of the uprisings are the defense of the rights of oppressed minorities and other marginalized parts of the population. So I wondered if y'all could talk about the anti-racist dimension of these struggles. I think especially concerning solidarity with the victims of genocide in Darfur. And so I think we'll take Adam, followed by Selma. So Adam, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think regarding this question, what I can say is already Sarah said before that this beginning of the current movement was also started in this area, Damazin, where it's also area with the poor people living and so. And this is in 13th of December when the current movement start. That's why it's clear. This is beginning also of there. It's not just the act who was now in Khartoum, in capital, taking place, but also it's starting from there. And as I said before, in different area, also in different cities, there's still also people sit in front of the army buildings. But talking about Darfur, I think we have to see also Darfur is also not about now solidarity is showing from other different people who are living in Khartoum or in other city to Darfur. It's also about what Darfur did all this time. I think the people of Darfur, they are fighting this regime since 2003, and they have giving everything from their own place and also from their people. And we see that the result of that is more than 2 million people who is as refugees, and more than 10,000 people who got killed in Sudan and Darfur. And that's why the old dictators, Omar Bashir, was demanded by International Criminal Court to be kept and bring to the court. And he is the only president who was demanded by International Criminal Court in that time. Also, we don't have to, talking about this also poor area, we don't have to forget the war who is going also since 2011 in Nuba Mountain, where is bombing taking place since 2011. And also is really horrible things going on there since 2011, and thousands of people, they lose their life. That's why I think this solidarity who's coming in the middle of the second, I think the second month of the demonstration, where the old regime start to somehow to play again this card of racism between the Sudanese society again, and he catch some student who don't have nothing to do with that, and they bring them to the national TV, and he say, yeah, you know, talking to the society in Khartoum, that these are people who is causing all this problem, and they starting burning autos in different places and so, and burning building and so, and they are the responsible of that, and they're coming from Darfur and so. And it was again trying to use this card of racism again to divide the society, but it was coming clear in the next days in the demo, where the people shouting, we are all Darfur, and shouting against this kind of racism. I think this somehow, for my point of view, is somehow bringing the society in Sudan more closer to their issues, that the only one who have to fight, and it's not about who's coming from and where you from, because it's also part of our long process in Sudan. Because for me, people talking, when they talk about colonial issue, it's also part of colonial issue, I think, racism now in Sudan. And when people talk about it, they forget that Sudan have also old somehow experience with a different kind of colonial history. We have the colonial history from Great Britain. That's what all people know about it. But also we have before with the Osmani Empire and also Egypt kind of also colonial history, and that's why it's like, for example, Islam get to Sudan, and all this history has to do with the crisis identities going on in Sudan, because people still, if you see, there is so much discussion inside the society about if we are belonging to Arab culture or belonging to African culture, because we are somehow maybe black people who speak Arabic, and that was also question all the time in Sudan, and what's all the time the army and dictatorship used to divide people in Sudan, and to saying people who's coming from some area where is it not really looking as Arab, or they are not really white enough, then they are trying to show this racism card against them and play it. But I see this revolution somehow now breaking this wall of racism in Sudan somehow. It's still long way to go. For example, for sure, that's not the end of it. But it was great to see that this kind of struggle also include this kind of anti-racism discussion. Not only the anti-racism discussion, I think it also was including so much other right of gay and lesbian and other things was people not talk about it in Sudan, as the Sudanese is like Muslim culture where some issue like this is not allowed to talk about it. And that's why, for example, for my opinion, all the time I tell my friend around that it's good that this struggle now in Sudan is taking now more than 5 months. It's going to 6 months because all the time and every new days there is new discussion where society talk about issues that they never talk about it, and it was taboo. There's no way to talk about it, but this revolution makes this somehow happen. For sure, we hope that the civil government comes soon and this somehow the struggle finish. But I think for tackling this racist issue and all this, we still, I think, we need more discussion in Sudan as now it's coming up to people to talk about it and show solidarities with the victim in genocide in Darfur and so on. But I think the racist and anti-racist movement in Sudan have to be continued because there is a deep discussion have to be taking place, especially regarding this identity crisis where we belong as Sudanese people, and not just seeing the things about now solidarity taking place because of what's going on in Darfur before, but also to tackle the issue why this problem is happening in Sudan. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. Selma, go ahead.
Yeah, concerning the oppressed minorities, the thing is that since the movement started, few things remain strangely invisible, especially because just a few months before they were like among the most heated debates within the country, and minorities were victim of severe attacks from the media. So among them, I would like to mention migrants, sub-Saharan migrants, Black people, who are often seen as a threat in the country among the media and the mainstream, but as well victims of attacks by the people and no one backing them. The situation is very similar to the one in Morocco, in which migrants are denied rights. So it can be surprising that in this demonstration with this nationalist character, this issue is not raised or even debated, because debates were very heated and people were very divided between solidarity, those who express solidarity, who reject racism against Black people, and those who are violently spreading lies about them. Also, concerning other oppressed minorities, of course, this movement will have to say something about LGBT minorities who are also existing, who are visible within the country, as well as people who are not following Sunni Islam. This is also other issues, but for the moment they are not raised, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't care about it, but we have to be very aware and careful on that matter. Concerning the redefinition of Algeria within the demonstration, something that was at the first place seen as a minority issue is actually a majority issue. I'm talking about the question of Amazigh and Tamazight, the language that originally existed in Algeria before the Arabs came. And this is interesting to see that since the Berber Spring in the 80s and throughout the movements, the Black Spring in 2001, that there is further acceptation among Algerians in general of their Amazigh parts of their identity. And you can see it because the Amazigh flag is now waving with the Algerian flag, knowing that Algerians are especially attached switch to the Algerian flag, it is interesting to see that they accept the Amazigh flag, which means that something very interesting has happened within the society before this movement, and that is now really, I would say, explicitly a matter of a national pride, and hopefully a regional pride, because Amazigh culture is the culture of all Northern Africa. The other, concerning the marginalized part, well, there are several ones, I would say. Every part that are not really in the city. So Algeria is mostly the most of the population is living on the coast, on the major cities. So central is Algiers, Wahran at the west, and Constantine at the eastern part. And so you have all the areas around who can be considered as marginalized parts. Kabylie can be seen in some areas as marginalized part, but the fact that they are close to Algiers, they're very much known in terms of movement. I can mention the city of Bijaya, who's a city who's close to Algiers and who's also playing an interesting leading role in terms of trade union organizing and have very strong demonstrations. Suburbs around Algiers, where you have most of the people, most of the poor people living there. Bourj Bouarivij, who's at the Algiers suburbs, has seen the biggest demonstration, maybe bigger than in Algiers, and very much lively, mostly, I would say, organized by young people, young football supporters. So these are, I would say, about the marginalized part who are playing an important role. The other one, I think, who's very strategic on two matters is the Sahara. The Sahara, around, 20% of the population lives in the Sahara. They are also very much marginalized. Many of them are Black, so they are subjected to anti-Black racism. Many of them don't speak that much French, which means that they can't really get into the best schools, I would say. The other thing is that many of them are more marginalized into getting a job. And the contradiction is that most of Algeria's income, 90% of Algeria's exportation, come from oil that is extracted in Sahara, and the people who live there are among the most poor. Recently, few weeks ago, you can see that the demonstrations were very, very much violent. There were clashes with the police near the city of Timimoun, in the area of Tinirkouk, where I come from, actually. And people were demonstrating, protesting the fact that they don't have jobs, that there is strong economic activity, but they are excluding from those jobs. The other issue is, so this one is strategic. Sahara is playing a strategic role on that matter. And at the same time, the extraction of oil, but also of gas and of fracking, is dangerous towards the people living there. So there were lots of movements before the revolution started, these recent months, that happened in the Saharan area with us. Despite the fact that the Sahara is very big, people are very much in solidarity to each other. Years ago, they staged sit-ins against the exploitation of fracking, because if you frack the ground, the Saharan ground, it means that people won't get water, and water is the most precious element for people to live. So the ecologic issue, I would say that people who were who started to organize in Sahara are very, very much conscious on the ecologic issue, and it raises also a general question of what kind of Algeria do we want? Do we still want to exploit petrol and waste the land, or rather answer to people's demand and think about a more long-term development that could be sustainable for everyone? And I think that the movements that started in the Sahara years ago has helped to develop a kind of ecologic consciousness that goes beyond the fact that saying that this petrol is our petrol, but also petrol, gas, and fracking are dangerous for land. So this is not just about petrol. This is not about who is getting the chair. This is about how can we get a clean land. And we can see that this idea of this ecological, just to conclude, has spread nationally because people want to, generally in demonstration, people clean up behind them. They don't want to let plastic on the ground. Students clean up the whole university, showing that they want a clean Algeria, a great and clean Algeria for everyone.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Sarah, did you want to add anything to this question specifically? You're muted.
Okay, in that case, we'll go to the next question, unless Sarah would like to respond.
There we
I
go.
do actually want to respond very briefly.
Yeah, go ahead. You got it. We can hear you.
Yeah, I mean, I think pretty much Adam has covered it, and also it's always fascinating for me to hear Salma and Hamza speak, because I think there is a lot of similarities actually between Algeria and Sudan in many ways. It's also an oil-based economy. I think a lot of what we see happening in Sudan has to do with a history of social exclusion and economic exclusion of what is spoken of in Sudan as al-manatiq al-muhammisha, or the peripheries, the areas outside the central region in the country where Khartoum is and the areas around it. And this is a racialized system of extraction that goes back to colonial times, but that was very much adopted by post-colonial regimes. So I think what's important is to also identify what this regime has brought on or innovated in terms of sort of its brutality and its structural violence, and what is actually aspects of this violence that have been promoted by successive post-colonial regimes, including the very brief periods of democracy. So this sort of link between the racialization of the economy and the racialization of the society, and its gendering as well, the way that it's gendered and racialized, I think these revolutions carry a lot of potential. At the same time, I think that this potential has to be nurtured. So even if we pass this very critical period into a time where we actually do have a shot at a transition into a different form of government and hopefully a different form of society, I think we have to deal at the basis of this with this kind of racialized forms of exclusion. And you can see that there is a lot happening, but I think on its own, it's not going to be enough to really change this deeply rooted and historically rooted elements of structural violence. So that's what I want to say for the moment. And yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much.
Brian, can I add something briefly?
Yeah, go ahead, then we'll go to
just
Preeti.
a quick comment. I'm not going to be long. And I think another dimension of anti-racism of these struggles could be the shattering of racist stereotypes and myths about the people in the region. These Arab and Muslim people are not fit for democracy. All they need is the stick. And I think this is important to emphasize, because it is for me a challenge to white supremacy and Orientalist views about the region.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So the next question is, what has been the role of labor unions? Adam.
Yeah, the labor unions, I think, is taking all the time big roles and playing big roles, not only in this current revolution in Sudan, but also in the two revolution was happening before in Sudan. That's why in the beginning of this dictatorship in 1998, when he came to power, he is starting with breaking the old structure of the labor union, and he bring his own people to make like non-elected, non-political labor union. But since 2012, the people start to make alternative labor union, and this labor union, Sudanese Professional Association, is one of them, who is alternative structure. The people start to do it since 2012, I think, and then in this.
Uh-oh. Adam got disconnected.
They had, do you hear me? Yeah, they had.
Yes.
They had one demonstration. They announced. Yeah, but now do you hear me now?
Yes,
Hello?
please continue.
Okay. Yeah, going back to say in the beginning of this revolution, this alternative Sudan Professional Association is alternative labor union who will try to challenge this idea of minimum wage and all this.
Aaron got disconnected again.
They already planned to have. No, I'm here. They planned somehow to have demonstration in that before the time of the revolution, but then they change it to the time of the demo, and they go together with the people, and also they calling in the Facebook page of them the Sudanese Professional Association all the time for demonstration, and it's also this different labor union who is including all professional people like part of this. Thanks.
Aram, you were getting disconnected. Can you speak to us again? Can you hear us?
Yeah. I'm hearing you. I don't know if you don't hear me, but I'm hearing you. I don't know what's going on.
Okay,
I'm hearing you.
There were brief moments where you were getting disconnected. Do you want to say anything else?
Not really. I think just in small words, they're playing big roles. But in this revolution, and especially the Sudanese Professional Association (SPA), where they are alternative labor union. Thanks.
Thank you, Hamza.
Yes, the labor unions do play a role, and they are actively participating in the current revolutionary dynamic. But unlike in Tunisia back in 2011, and currently in Sudan, their role has been very limited because they have been weakened considerably in the last few decades. First of all, when I'm talking about labor unions here, I mean the autonomous, independent ones, not the UGTAF, like the General Union of Algerian Workers, which is the biggest trade union in the country, but is affiliated to the regime, the system in place, and has been playing a reactionary role against workers' interests. There is currently a movement inside this union to reappropriate it and cleanse it from its corrupt and pro-regime leadership. Actually, many trade unionists have been protesting in several regions of the country for several weeks now, demanding from the current general secretary to step down. And I think these efforts must be strengthened, as this will be a very positive achievement for the workers themselves and can give an impetus to the current revolutionary process by involving workers much more, and I think which can take the revolution to its next stage of escalation and resistance. As for the independent trade unions, they have been involved in the uprising since day one. The unions of the education and health sectors have called for an organized strikes and protests, asking for their rights and in solidarity with the movement. There was a general strike in the first few weeks of the uprising, and played an important role in pushing Bouteflika to abdicate. Lawyers and judges associations have also given their support by refusing to oversee any elections under the current systems. And much more broadly, students are also trying in the process of organizing themselves at the national level. However, not everything is rosy, because at the current juncture, there is a political deadlock where the military high command is rejecting any transitional period and insisting that presidential elections be held urgently, which means the status quo and the reconduction of the old regime. I'm just a bit surprised that the independent unions are not campaigning right now for a general strike in order to force the military to yield, as was the case with Sudan. In the contrary, we've seen a configuration of some autonomous unions calling for a short democratic transition that shouldn't go beyond 6 months. For me, this kind of strategy is not revolutionary at all and can facilitate the work of the counter-revolution and the restoration of the ancien regime.
Thank you, Madam.
So that's a good segue to the next question, which is about the forces of counter-revolution. And so the first question that Frida asked was, of course, about continuities and discontinuities with the Arab Spring. And one of those continuities is that of counter-revolution. Like while this is happening in Algeria and Sudan, we see in Syria, Bashar al-Assad is crushing the remnants of the Syrian revolution. There are bombs falling in Idlib. At the same time, Saudi Arabia, Russia, China, and the US back the current Sudanese military regime. The current leader of the Sudanese military government, General al-Burhan, is meeting currently in Saudi Arabia with governments of the Arab League, and he backed forces in the Saudi war on Yemen. So with all these sort of things going on, what kind of beacon of hope do you see the Sudanese and Algerian uprisings raising that could challenge these regional and international powers of counter-revolution and express solidarity with, labor, feminist, and oppressed minority struggles in the region broader? And that's kind of a big, complicated question, but we'll go to Sarah, followed by Selma. Go ahead, Sarah.
Thanks a lot for the question. I think it's important to mention in the case of Sudan that this uprising started not long after Omar al-Bashir went to visit Bashar al-Assad in Syria. And that was a notable visit in the sense that Arab leaders have not, of course, been visiting Bashar al-Assad. And that was an attempt, or it was rather an attempt in Sudan for the Bashir regime to sort of appeal to Russia or make itself attractive to Russia. I think, I see it's a very, very complicated question regionally for us in Sudan, not just in relation to the Middle East and the Arab world, but also, of course, we have a very specific identity because we're an African Arab country. I think our links to Africa have always been downplayed by successive regimes. And this is one of the things that I think myself and many Sudanese hope will change in the future, that we will strengthen our relationship with also our sub-Saharan African neighbors. But in relation to this incredibly complicated question, I would say that I'm actually sometimes surprised by the extent to which there is not more attention to what is happening in Sudan and Algeria, not just in relation to the region as a beacon of hope, because of course the region has gone through a lot since 2011, and it's a moment, I think recently a friend of mine described it as kind of a widespread deep depression. But I think in relation to kind of what's happening globally, where you see right-wing movements and in some cases fascist movements taking over across the globe, from European countries to the US, to Brazil, to India, and so forth. And I think what is happening in Sudan and Algeria is incredibly important because it shows, number one, that these very simplistic ideas about failure that the uprisings in recent years have failed. It's an incredibly simplistic idea because, as I believe Hamza said early on, our social movements are an accumulation of lessons that we learned. They're also accumulations of traumas, but they're also accumulations of learning processes. So for me to see youth who are leading this revolution in Sudan, sort of using symbolism at times and songs and chants from the 1964 uprising, or using certain strategies that we've been seeing used in other spaces across the region in the uprisings, but also innovating and coming up with their own strategies. I think it shows that there's the possibility and the space for peaceful, people-led, anti-racist, anti-sexist movements that are very much challenging also the class structure and the continuation of the colonial extraction policies is not only possible, but that it is possible through on-the-ground organization, on-the-ground strategy, and it is also possible through the building of broad alliances. So I think it's not only, I think, inspirational, but I think to say that it's inspirational, I'm always afraid to use this word because it assumes that it's, things are now easy and we can be like the poster child of success. No, we are at a very critical moment where things could get very ugly very quickly. And so what we need is both support. We need to be a source of inspiration, but this inspiration has to be backed by actual concrete action. Transnational, internationalist action is what we need. And we also need in this region to exchange lessons and strategies, because I think sort of nationalism tends to be very strong in these uprisings. And the idea is almost like we're always talking about ourselves as unique somehow. Our suffering is unique and our movements are unique. They are unique in some ways. But I think when I listen to what happens in Algeria, when I see what's happening in Tunisia, actually after what is considered a successful revolution, what was happening in Egypt, or what's happening in Zimbabwe earlier on in the year with also a lot of protests in relation to the economic conditions, or in Haiti, which also happened. I think there's a lot of room for us to learn from each other and to also build movements that are based on strategy, on organization, on being able to sustain ourselves and sustain each other. And I think I'll leave it at that for the moment too. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Selma?
Yes, first concerning the African continent, one of the two big common points with Sudan and Algeria is that these are countries who has big economic weight. Algeria is the fourth biggest GDP, and Sudan is the sixth GDP country in the whole continent, which means that when a revolution is happening, it can have an impact also on the region. Not saying that people are rich, but there is a wealth, a consequent wealth that is being produced. The other point is that concerning the Algerian state, the trauma of the war of the independent war gave a space also for the Algerian state to assert its own independence, also economic independence. So I can hardly see, and you can see it in the way France also reacts to the current movement. They don't want to get angry with anyone, nor the people, nor the government, because they need them for business. A country like France imports 11% of the gas from Algeria. So there is this relation of interdependent relation, despite the fact that I would say petrol, gas have their prices fixed on the global market. Still, the Algeria managed through its own history, through its history, to avoid any kind of external intervention. And actually, even the neoliberal measure who allowed that are very unpopular among the ruling class. There are fights, but mostly among the working class who are against that kind of neoliberalized integration, economic integration. So this is for the economic part, and actually the regime is also trapped into the independent stuff. They have to show off that the country is still independent. So even if they want, for example, I just compare in terms of hope is that yes, there are lots of I would say repression, and historically the repression could be very bloody, but for the moment this is not happening, and the fact that the movement is also massive and unique since the independence can give hope. Like if we compare the situation in Syria and let alone the repression, the movement was huge. It was well organized from below. The only reason why it has been crushed, it's because Bashar al-Assad has received regional support from Iran and regional support from Russia. I can hardly see today Algeria trying to benefit from any regional support in the Mediterranean region or even among their neighbors. They would be immediately the regime itself would be destroyed because its own meaning is being independent. So there is still this idea, and so even among the demonstration, you have people are scared of this, or even of this happening behind. So you have lots of, I would say, placards. You have huge, what we say, tifo is a building, is the building size of a banner who are against France, who are against the US, who are against Saudi Arabia, entering into internal Algerian affairs. So you have this way of seeing like regional powers as already a threat, and the people who's been fighting for independence don't want to see themselves being dictated by another country. So to this point, I think it can be also a good starting point for all the countries in the region. But at the same time, like Algeria, the fact that there is a movement that is now appearing on the international level, while Algeria was not that much known on the international level, neither the movements were known on the international level. But the fact that they are now visible on that level maybe can allow also among the people to express solidarity beyond borders, and solidarity beyond only the question of Palestine, which is deeply colonial. So that's why people raise the flag of Palestine. But I think we still need to see people who learn also from Sudan. I think there is also some kind of inspiration that come from Sudan, from the fact that everybody came out on the street and it has changed the situation. It has entered the mind of the Algerians, but there is also a long way, and I think it's a movement also on a long. It's a long-term movement in which people have to also consciously accept the fact that they are influenced by the regional movement, by Sudan also. And I think it's key because it could break also anti-Black racism to show off that Black people are also at the forefront of the movement, and they're actually at the forefront of the movement, and they're actually more organized than Algerians are on a national level. So it's still not visible, but it has to be encouraged and raised up. And organizations for the movement are mostly involved internally, mostly seeing themselves about what's happening. And I hope that also in the process they will open up about the need of being more in solidarity with the struggling countries around, with Morocco, who started the movement much before Algeria, with Tunisia's revolution, but also with what's happening in Mali and Senegal in general. The other thing also that just to finish a little bit about it, is that Algeria also is playing a key role in anti-terrorism politics. So it is an important ally to Occidental powers for all the anti-terrorism intelligence matter, but also on controlling the borders. So it is very important for this. I think even if it's not internationalistic yet, the very fact of the weakening of this regime could also help opening the borders, help breaking ties with the EU, which is the major economic partner with Algeria, but also in terms of security partner. So it could help also to reshape the whole region and maybe reconnect in a more solidarity way.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for all these very illuminating responses. We have 2 more questions left from the moderators, and we have already exceeded our time limit for the first part of the meeting. So we'll ask for briefer responses to the remaining 2 questions. So the next question is, the 2011 uprisings prided themselves in being free of ideology and leaderless. While that claim was liberatory in the sense of attempting to oppose dogmatism and centralization, those uprisings did not offer an emancipatory anti-capitalist vision that was also feminist, multiracial, multicultural, and open to gender fluidity. Now, in light of the experiences of the past 8 years and the global historical failures experienced in the name of emancipation, how are these lessons expressing themselves on the ground? How do anti-capitalist or socialist ideas feature in these uprisings? How are the ideas of thinkers like Karl Marx or Frantz Fanon relevant? Adam?
Regarding this question, is what I can say to make it really short, that first Sudan have been ruled by somehow Muslim brother, and they have this ideology of Islam to be ruled as one of the rule who to rule the whole countries, and now the people have this revolution against it. Then it is clear that the people made from beginning clear signal that they don't need any more kind of religion inside the system of ruling the country, and citizenship have to be is the only matter of being in this country in Sudan. That's why we think it's also somehow kind of develop of ideologies that to move religion and all other things who just things have to do with the person at the self, with his God, if he's believe or not. And I think in this way we can see this somehow is relevant now issue in Sudan. About anti-capitalism, we can say it is also playing a small role in Sudan. I think it's not big role because the people is poor, and they are also having this revolution somehow to get something for themselves. Then it's being big part of the people who's talking about to build the country in the way of like how to be in, how is being in Europe and how to be in, I don't know. Then it's this idea of like real fighting capitalism is not really relevant now in there, but we can say it's also part of the discussion now in the revolution in Sudan, because also we have a different party in the history of politicals in Sudan. We have different parties who have these ideologies of anti-capitalism and socialist, like Communist Party in Sudan, and they somehow reflecting about this issue. And also the labor union, as we said before, is also playing big role in that. He's also talking about the right have to be to the worker. It's also kind of way of talking about anti-capitalism and the right for worker, but it's not the big issues now, I think, in the discussion in the Sudan. As I said before, in this area now in the sitting, is all the time taking place workshops, seminars, and so people still talk about it and negotiate these issues. But I think it is in the comments time it will be biggest issue. But now I think it is not playing big roles.
Frida, shall I go? I think this question necessitates a whole lecture, but I don't know. I'll try to do it in less than 4 minutes, hopefully. Just to pick on your question about ideology, I agree that the Arab uprisings, and including the current Algerian one, can be qualified as a revolution without revolutionary ideas, as they were lacking the kind of radicalism that marked earlier revolutions in the 50s and 60s and 70s, where anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist sentiments were expressed very clearly through well-articulated visions. As you said in your question, these uprisings pride themselves to be free of ideology, non-ideological or post-ideological, as how people describe them. But I don't think that's entirely true. I would say that the neoliberal paradigm being taken as natural and common sense has permeated the way the demands have been articulated. And it has shaped how people organize themselves. We've seen how the revolutionaries of the Arab Spring were preoccupied with broad issues, with liberal broad issues of human individual rights, political accountability, fighting corruption, and legal reform. Basically, what I want to say is that neoliberalism, in a way, altered the nature of radical politics and somehow de-radicalized dissent. And this is extremely worrying. When it comes to the lessons that can be learned from the first wave of the Arab uprisings, and I insist that the Algerians can be analyzed within this optic, as it can be analyzed with other through other lenses, like the anti-colonial struggle, their own experiences. So the lessons, I think, number one, that changing the head of state and removing a few officials is not enough to radically change the system. Based on the Egyptian experiences and their own ones, the Algerians and Sudanese learned not to trust the military high command and are pushing for a civilian democratic rule. And it is, for me, becoming clear, and I hope that I will be proved wrong by the Algerian ongoing struggle, that horizontal movements are extremely vulnerable and tend to be ephemeral in the face of more organized and entrenched counter-revolutionary forces. When it comes to the part of your question regarding Marxism and Fanonism, I think definitely they are very relevant when we talk about revolution and emancipation. Marxism helps you bring a class analysis for a true liberation of the marginalized classes. And I think the Marxist left should be the force that bring freedom and equality together, not only political equality, but socio-economic equality that eliminates those class disparities in society. Because democracy cannot be complete under the framework of the domination of capital and the dictatorship of the market. When it comes to Fanon, he's a kind of a mentor and a spiritual leader to me. He believed in the masses and what they can do. And he argued that the masses always affirm their role as agents of their own destiny, even in the midst of the worst disaster. And he contrasted this with his instinctive aversion to the national bourgeoisie that will betray the masses, halt liberation, and replace, their colonial counterparts.
4 minutes.
Okay, I'll finish now. I think Fanon predicted the bankruptcy and the stupidity of those bourgeoisies and argued that we need to go from a national political consciousness into a social consciousness. And I think these ideas need to inspire us, but unfortunately the left is weak. But I think it's in these moments that it can revive itself and revive those ideas.
Great. Thanks, Hamza. And we'll organize your full lecture on that later. So we're going to move on to the last question from the moderators, and I think we're going to have time to take at least 3 questions from the internet. We'll be going a little over time, but I think this is a good conversation. So the last question is a compound question. The first is, what do you see as the prospects for the future of the uprising? What are the challenges and what will it take to overcome them? And then the second part of it is, what kind of international solidarity do you hope for to support the uprisings? And so maybe we could take each panelist for about 3 or 4 minutes and go, we'll take Sarah and then Selma and then Hamza and then Adam. So Sarah, do you want to get us started off? Yeah,
sure. In terms of the challenges that we're facing, I think I sort of already hinted at the fact that we are at an incredibly fragile moment right now of the revolution. Somehow people have managed to maintain a presence on the street for close to 6 months, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week during Ramadan, 40-some degrees Celsius heat. But the sort of coalition that is sort of leading the negotiations with the Transitional Military Council, which is composed of the Sudanese Professionals Association, which still carries a very high degree of legitimacy with the revolutionaries and the protesters on the street. But it also also includes many political parties in the opposition, as well as civil society organizations and some of the armed movements that have been fighting the state in different regions, and some but not all. It is very, very clear right now that the military council does not want to hand over power to civilians. It is very, very clear that they see themselves as the rightful leaders of the country. It is very, very clear that there are incredible economic and strategic interests that they have in remaining in control. And so a lot of the negotiations have sort of broken down on this aspect of their role, essentially, in the transition, and also the length of the transition. They would like 2 years. The Forces for the Declaration of Freedom and Change, the coalition that's negotiating, has proposed 4 years. I suppose the compromise would be 3, but essentially we also see in the last weeks a return of violence in Khartoum in the area of the sitting itself. Of course, it's really important to mention that the violence never ceased in other states. For example, in Darfur, where the sittings were brutally attacked and people continued to be killed, protesters continued to be killed. So there's a dual strategy, essentially, of being more careful in the capital, right, and with certain constituencies than they are in the areas where they believe people to be marginalized enough that they can get away with violence against them. So we are at a moment where also the international agendas, for the most part, are either silent or somehow tacitly allowing the military transitional council to continue to hold on to power, and or actually actively lending support to the military council to remain in power. So I would say, in terms of challenges, it's a question of, on the one hand, being able to sustain the civil disobedience, to widen the civil disobedience, but on the other hand is, what are we going to do to pressure the military transitional council? Because the risk of violence is very high. We already see this return of violence, but also the risk of fragmentation within the coalition itself, and sort of the issues of trust between those negotiating on behalf of the people and the people themselves and their own relationships. And very quickly, in terms of the solidarity aspects of it, it sort of hurts us in Sudan in a way that we were under US sanctions for so long, since the 90s. And that is one of the elements that has isolated us in terms of sort of the international stage, but also the fact that the regime actively isolated us in many different ways by shutting down the internet, sort of to quell dissent, and so forth. On the other hand, what we do have going for us is, unfortunately, due to the economic and political and conflict situation in the country, the Sudanese diaspora is massive. There are millions of Sudanese abroad. They have very much backed, it's a very political diaspora that has very much backed this revolution. And so I would say that there is a very strong need to keep the revolution visible, to spread good information about what's happening there, to draft union resolutions. We already see some examples of this, but there needs to be a lot more of this, and to lobby various governments, the European Union with its sort of externalized border agendas, dealing with the regional dynamics and so forth, in order to make sure that the left is giving as much support to this uprising and to the Algerian uprising as possible.
Thank you so very much. Selma?
Yes, concerning the prospects, I think Hamza talked about it a little, but the left, the ability for the left to revive within these movements are really key, because anger is there, movements are very strong, and there is also a strong, I would say, legacy of strikes. Algeria has been staging strikes. You have lots of trade unions, and some strikes really gained, like in the early 2000s, many people, and even in 2011, people won over the strikes, have better, managed to get better paid. So clearly, what is very frustrating with this movement, when you see now everybody on the street, is for the left to manage to get gains, and there are two key aspects that in which the left is put to test is this economic concrete situation is going to change for the people, and on the other hand, also how is the left going to respond to the current repression happening since the beginning. One of the first demonstrators, Al-Haj Garmoul, has been arrested. He has been arrested in the first demonstration. He's still in jail. So the left also needs to reconnect with the impoverished youth, and not only learning from Marxism, but bringing something new to the Marxist. Sorry, there are screams around. Bringing something new to the Marxist, I would say, theory, because we are not facing only working class people, we're also facing, and it's a common feature with all the revolution happening in the era, impoverished youth, so people who don't have job, who don't have workplaces to organize. So there are new ways we need to organize, neighbor per neighbor. We have also to learn from football supporters the way they organize. So the left has to reconnect to all that and trying to create something new and create lessons for everyone. So and we also should be aware about something else, is that it's not just a short-term movement, it's a long-term movement. I was very surprised to see like a young girl speaking on at the Algerian TV, independent TV, saying that we are ready to struggle for 50 years if we need to. And we have to take into account the fact that the young generations who are raising up and who are the major part of the people who are struggling are ready for a long-term movement, because they've seen that it's not that easy for the military to let down the power and the economic power. It takes a long determined struggle. So long-term determined struggle means that people through that struggle will have the time to reconnect to each other, but also to organize, because Algeria is also, like Sudan, a very big country, and people still need to connect to each other. We need to decentralize the struggle. Everything is not just happening in the capital, but also in the marginalized area. So all these areas need to be reconnected, and those are the huge tasks for the left, in which they can also, not the left only itself, but I would say s'appuyer sur, I would say they should also be open to support for the new generations to do so, because new generations are also not out of politics. They're learning very fast, and maybe faster than political organization. So they have to get inspired from this youth. So just to finish about what kind of international solidarity do we need, just to say that, of course, you have the basic links with the trade unions, the need for also to raise funds for those organizations to be able to organize and to have economic independence. We see how NGOs have a tendency to hijack this independence. So we need class solidarity. On the other hand, I'm actually living in France, and so in France, you have also a big diaspora in Algeria for years and years. Those countries are very close to each other, and you have lots of also Algerian people who are organized. For example, today there is a whole session in central Paris that's been organized by Agir pour le changement démocratique en Algérie, l'ACDA, who have also linked with trade unions. You have lots of Algerians and children of Algerians who are very much involved in the social movements in France, which means that we have the political space to do something, and the fact that there is a big diaspora also abroad allows for direct pressure towards those powers. Concerning the Sudanese, I can tell that the fact that you have migrants now in Paris that are very much there. They are also very much organized. They are trying to raise awareness towards trade unions, etc. They are staging demos. And they are linking the situation, the migrant situation, to what's happening. So many links are happening to the borders.
Great, thanks so much. And sorry to remind people of time, but Hamza followed by Adam. Go ahead, Hamza.
I think Selma already covered most of it, so maybe I'll talk mainly about what kind of international solidarity we need. I think something that needs to be done is to emphasize the radical voices and give space to progressive analysis that go beyond the usual mainstream liberal bullshit. Try to establish contact with comrades and lefty organizations and unions on the ground and see what kind of support they need. I think something very important for me, I think, is bring the Sudanese and Algerian struggles together, to learn from each other, to reinforce each other, because I think there is hope, but at the same time, we cannot be naive. There is a huge constellation of counter-revolutionary forces from regional powers like Saudi Arabia and Emirates, to Western imperialist powers like France, Britain, and the US, to reactionary forces in our own country. So yeah, we need to reinforce those struggles and maybe even launch campaigns against those counter-revolutionary forces. As for Middle Eastern and Arab and other African socialists and lefty activists, I think they shouldn't be shying away of sharing their own thoughts and critiques and the lesson they learned from their own, proper confiscated revolutions. Because, ideas of revolutions are very important now, and people need to learn from past revolutions. I'll stop here.
Excellent. Adam?
Yeah, I think Sarah has said all of it. I think I don't have so much things to say, but just one point I think has to do also with the question about what challenge we have to overcome and also what kind of solidarity can be. And I mean, I just need to highlight one point that I think from leftists, they can play big roles in anti-war campaign or something like this, because I think it's important, especially in the case of Sudan, when we see that power like Saudi Arabia and also United States and Arab Emirates are playing big role now to not really that's why I think it is important that to see this point of like, because in Sudan now there is a different kind of power who is playing around, not making it easy for the people to get the civil government. One issue that the Sudanese soldiers from Speed Forces army that's fighting in war in Yemen, and especially this war in Yemen internationally also is not really covered, and no one need to talk about it, because we know that it is pushing by Saudi Arabia, Arab Emirates, and other countries, who is international powers like United States, Donald Trump, right wings, who's saying he's really proud of selling the biggest amount of weapon to Saudi Arabia. I think point like this, we have to focus in it, because it's also for us as a people in Sudan, it's not easy now to overcome this issue, especially if we see this has to do with also international war and also power of international media. But I think it's left have the right or have more chance now to get in and try to make at least in this point anti-war campaign to talk about this issue, especially I think there is no covering international media or everything's about what's going on in Yemen now, and we as part of people in Sudan involving now in this by soldiers, they are fighting there, and in the same times also they somehow using this card also that military don't need to give up easy the power, because they're afraid that they somehow they will not be more working together with Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia putting also really its own forces to stop this civil government to come to Sudan because of this. Thank you. I will stop here.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So we have time where we're going to try to take maybe 3 more questions from folks from the internet, and then that will conclude our time today. So the first question from Elia is specifically to Selma. And so asking Selma if you could elaborate a little more on the family code that you mentioned and what that is and its significance.
Yeah, sorry about muting. Well, the family code has been settled in the 80s. I don't have all the details, but it has created a status of women as minor for life, which means that for example, for anything she would like to do, she has to get the approval of a tutor, of a male tutor, which means that it could be her brother or her father if she's not married, or her uncle if she doesn't have a father, or even when she's a mother, it could be her son, because she can't date. She's not allowed to take decisions by herself. And one of the shocking matches I remember is, for example, if women wanted to travel, they need to get the authorization of the father. The paternal authorization is needed to go somewhere with the children. And until recently, I think 2014, it has been removed under feminist pressure. The other element is also heritage, which is inspired by the so-called Islamic law, which means that they get only a third of the heritage. The fact that Tunisian women gained over that matter also inspired Algerian women to do so. So those are the elements. The other element is also the divorce. Like, for women to get a divorce is very, very complicated and almost an impossible issue. Back in the years, I remember that the family code also allowed women to be removed from schools when they were young, like from 6, 7, or 8 years old. I barely remember. So the family could remove her from schools for domestic purposes, which has been also removed years ago under campaigning and massive feminist movement. So those are the few elements that is the family code, and it was seen as a big, I would say, betrayal from the revolutionary principles of the Algerian independent movement, which relied a lot on women, and so they've been stabbed on the back in these early 80s. But maybe, Hamza, if you know a bit better than me about the family code, you can also develop.
No, I think you covered it very well.
Great, thanks. So our next question is from Miriam A. And the question is, how have there been responses from other places that since the uprisings regionally in 2010, 2011 have had transformative leaps themselves? And the question asker specifically indicates the uprising in the Rif region of Morocco in 2016. So have there been other places that have had responses and other regional responses to the Algerian and Sudanese current uprisings? Who would like to take a stab at that question?
Brian, I didn't understand the question.
Yeah, the question was basically, have there been responses from other places in the region to the current uprisings in Algeria and Sudan? Like, what have those responses been like? And then the question asker specifically refers to Morocco, but I think that you could talk about whatever.
I could maybe be brief.
Okay.
Some regional responses to the Algerian uprisings, and I think some of them have been seen actually from Morocco. And I've listened and I watched some chants by football fans in stadiums in Morocco, like making references directly to the Algerian Revolution. So these are revolutions. They go beyond borders and they inspire people, and somehow people get into dialogue. And the same thing happened actually when the Rif uprising was taking place in Morocco. Algerians were following a lot, and they showed some kind of solidarity, even if it wasn't social media. Maybe Selma can add to this.
Thanks. Sarah, did you want to add anything to that from the Sudanese context?
I can't, I can't speak about Morocco specifically. For us, of course, of major importance are neighbors, like direct neighbors. So I would say, for example, we have on our borders, we have Libya, we have Egypt, we have Eritrea, we have Ethiopia, and of course, most importantly, we have South Sudan, which gained its independence in 2011 from Sudan. And this is one of the very sore topics actually for people in the north, because one of the things that the regime is accused of is also leading to the split of the country. I think regionally, I would say, Ethiopia is going through a very not an uprising, but a kind of opening up of its political space, a kind of reform process. And so I think they're watching very carefully what is happening. When it comes from Egypt, you get different responses from different countries. Egypt has a very, very complicated relationship with Sudan. It sees the regime sees its sort of successive Egyptian regimes have seen Sudan as sort of the backyard of Egypt. It's also strategically important in terms of the Nile waters and for other reasons. And the Sisi government is very much, I would say, I would venture to say, very much invested in the failure of this uprising. It does not want to see a country on its border sort of succeed in what they managed to suppress through a counter-revolution in Egypt. They also are very, military regimes like to do business with other military regimes. I think that's an important point to make. And so Egypt is also allied with Saudi Arabia and so forth. So I think their role as a regime has been very negative. But I think we have had a lot of support from Egyptian revolutionaries and from people who on the left in Egypt who are very much looking to Sudan and very much supporting what is happening there. I think in terms of South Sudan, it is also not in the interest of the regime there for there to be a revolution in Sudan that succeeds and for an end to the military regime there and for war. They've had an up and down relationship with the government in Khartoum, but their governance style is very similar to the Bashir regime. So I think it's very mixed depending on what level you're speaking about. By and large, most of the authoritarian regimes in the region very much want to see this revolution fail. But I think on the grassroots level, there is a lot of support and a lot of hope. I think we need more concrete interventions, more concrete support and links to be forged between us and regional countries.
But Brian, can I add something to that?
Sure, go ahead.
Because I was talking mainly about the reaction of the people rather than the official reactions. So when we go to the Moroccan monarchy, so just to talk about it regionally, the forces of the counter-revolutions, including the dictatorships and the absolute monarchies in the region, are definitely hostile to both uprisings in Sudan and Algeria, and they want them to fail, as Sarah mentioned. Saudi Arabia and the Emirates do not only have influence in Sudan, but they do have influence in Algeria too. In fact, the head of the high military command in Algeria, Gaid Saleh, is very close to the Emiratis. And clearly the Emiratis are interfering. I've heard just a few days ago that Saudi Arabia and Emirates are pumping a lot of multi-million investments in Algeria. And clearly these are, counter-revolutionary interferences because the success, hopefully, of the Algerian or the Sudanese revolution will be a danger to them. And at the same time, coincidentally, in Libya, at the same time these two uprisings are happening, General Haftar, launched his military strikes on Tripoli. And I'm not sure if it is a coincidence. So that's why I always emphasize that we cannot be naive about, the regional counter-revolutionary forces and even the role of the Western powers in this. France, even if it's saying we do not interfere, there are things that are happening, in the back door, and we need to be aware of these things.
Great. And then Selma, you want to...
Yes. Maybe the relationship to the neighbors. Just to complete what was just said before, is that first The Tunisian people, when they saw the Algerian rising, started to stage demonstration also in Tunis in solidarity, and it has raised also fears. Even the current president, Beji Qaid Sibsi, who's very old, publicly said that he won't present itself as the next president again. Out of fear. So you have this kind of relationships that exist. Also, I talked about the question of the Amazigh identity, and I think it can play a key role into broadening the solidarity beyond the I would say the tensions between especially Morocco and Algeria. The Reef movement also has raised up its Amazigh identity, and it's hard not to, when you say you're Amazigh, not to relate to the Hirak movement in Morocco. And I think the left has also a responsibility. Maybe I'm not well informed, but Nasser Zefzefi has sent a letter in solidarity with the Algerian movement, but I haven't heard any. I don't know, or it's been very marginal or very secondary, but the left didn't say anything about it. And I think it is very important also for the Algerian left to assert its transnational identity as Amazigh and come in support to the current repression our Moroccan fellows are having. And we need to relate to the history of our solidarity. Algeria couldn't gain any independence without the help of the neighboring countries, without the help of the Reef fighters. The Algeria couldn't be an independent state. So today there is also a legacy of this that should be continued and should be relinked in some sense, despite the nationalistic divisions. And on that point, I will hardly insist. The left in Algeria has to say something about what's happening in Morocco in support to the current movements.
Excellent, thank you. So we have time for one more question, I think. And so the last question is from Oakland, and it just asks if the listeners could hear more about the economic questions and how they're being raised on the ground. So maybe I'll see if Adam wants to go first, as you haven't spoken yet on one of these questions. Do you want to take this question up? How are the economic questions being raised on the ground?
Yeah, for sure. The economical question, I think, is all the time is part of this revolution, especially in Sudan. If I hear also is part of the what's going on in Algeria also, because we have this long revolutions in Sudan since 30 years when this government come to power, we say, but also some people consider that this cost of the bread was really being high enough that people also somehow come to street because they don't have enough to eat or something like this. Also, there is this, as Sarah also said before, this split of Sudan to north and south. It's also costing Sudan so much in this topic of economical, whereas all petrol and oil is gone with a new country, South Sudan. That's why I think it is this part of it is like economical issues. It was all the time topic until now, but then it's also as I mentioned before, also about labor market where this is alternative labor market union. Sudanese Professional Association (SPA) has the part of organizing the whole this. So they're talking about the minimum wage, and so then in different perspective is all the time this economical question was there all the time, and it's still going on, especially when we talk also about all this new idea about how to build Sudan, how we need to build Sudan. It's also there's some discussion that's going on now since long time how people need to build Sudan and in which ways they need to build Sudan. Then we can also see it is playing big roles. Yeah.
Thank you. Sarah, did you want to add anything to that? And then we'll go over to see if someone from Algeria.
Yeah, I think Adam really covered it very well. I mean, the main issue I think is with the sort of the regime destroyed sort of the sort of traditional backbone of the Sudanese economy, which was agriculture and sort of the industries around agriculture. And it focused and put all of its energy into oil. Oil, of course, is a lot easier to loot, right? It's much easier to sort of control and to capture by the regime. And so the strategy backfired when the South Sudanese opted to declare independence, and with them went 70% of the oil deposits. There is still an economic relationship there because the oil has to go through the north in order to reach the Red Sea and sort of be exported or extracted, whichever way you want to put it. So a lot of what's part of this declaration for freedom and change is the economic issue is the war issue is the #1 priority to work to end the wars. And of course, that is partly linked to working to build a more equitable economic system, a more redistributive economic system. I think there are two voices in the revolution. There's a kind of neoliberalized voice, which is about technocracy and about, if everyone just does their job, things would work. I think as leftists, we say that that's not enough. We have to redistribute wealth. It's not just about managing things well and ending corruption. And I think that is the other voice that has to be really pushed and promoted. And I think in regards to the early question about Marx, I mean, people don't talk about Marx in Sudan, but they do. There are ideas that are very powerful, which is that there are certain sectors like education and like health that have to be public sectors and have to be free and accessible to all. And that is not a controversial idea in the Sudanese uprising. What is controversial is how to manage the economy, particularly in terms of its export sector, and how this wealth is going to be redistributed.
Thank you so much. Selma or Hamza, did you want to speak about the Algerian context? Selma?
Yeah, I can start actually. Well, the economic demands are not very different from the Sudanese people. It's all about there are higher prices. There is a inflation. Inflation has rocketed those recent years, so it has impacted also the way Algerians see the current regime. So. Still, there are no common slogans, etc. I don't see that much on the streets. Slogans are based on economic issue, like on concrete economic issue. Despite the strikes calling for better pay for people, for also movements from people who are unemployed are very important. But I think also if you speak. In my opinion, if you speak individually to each Algerian, he can be very, very sharp into economic critique on the way money has been, I would say, stolen by the army, etc. What is not clear is also the relationship to the bosses. There are so many debates, but the fact that there is a debate also shows that people are very much aware of the current situation. So these are, I would say, like roughly the elements. But yes, the demands can be. I think I feel hopeful about the fact that we can go just beyond rights or just on the abstract matter and talk about concrete change, about the control of prices, to have proper there's a dog, I'm sorry, suburbs. So there can be, I think when you discuss individually, you have those kind of very concrete demands that needed to be a bit more, I would say, present on the general sphere. Just to finish up, I think one of the most sensitive elements on the economic matter is the lack of future for the youth, and the fact that the country is pushing people to migrate and risk their life in the Mediterranean Sea. And so the migration issue is very important because millions and millions of young Algerians have left out of misery. And this is a clear economic matter. So the movement today, also the movement's purposes today, means that we need to bring back hope to the youth, and we need to bring them economic, I would say, economic, comment dire, economic rights, concrete rights, also among disabled people and the unemployed who could be tempted to risk their life crossing the Mediterranean Sea.
Great, thank you so much. Hamza, did you want to add anything for a few minutes?
Yes, so just actually to emphasize what Selma was saying, because the economic question has been at the heart of the current uprising, because since 2016, with the decrease of the oil prices, there was a climate of economic austerity that led to popularization, unemployment, and the worsening of workers and the popularized masses conditions. And you can see the kind of the mobilizations, the workers, the popular classes, and even the students. But as Selma was saying, I don't think it's been addressed enough. And in that sense, I envy my Sudanese comrades, because they have a kind of coalitions and structures in the place that bring in those issues in the open to discuss them, at least, even if lefty ideas are not the dominant ones. At least you discuss them, because at the same time that this uprising is happening, multinationals are continuing to do their business. And actually there is something happening with Total now acquiring a concession left by another American company, Anadarko. And there are things that are happening. So without economic justice, without popular sovereignty on natural resources, I don't think a revolution can succeed. So I hope that these questions would be addressed very soon. Otherwise, the liberal forces would take the argument.
Excellent. And so with that, that brings us to the end of our event. And so firstly, Frida and I want to thank our panelists for spending your time and sharing your insightful viewpoints with us. I think that I've learned a lot, and I'm sure all our viewers have as well. Just want to thank the folks who are watching on YouTube and Facebook, and for folks to use this video as a tool and share it around more, and really to take heed of the suggestions of solidarity that our panelists put out, to spread good information, to pass union resolutions, to build an anti-war movement, to speak to the youth, and to continue to look to find ways to exchange lessons and strategies, which hopefully this has been a contribution to. And then lastly, I want to give a special shout out to Shireen Akram-Boshar, Isabel Barter, and Elia El-Kazan, who really did a lot of work to make this possible. And with that, we will look to the Facebook page and the YouTube. We'll post information about how to contact us. Hopefully this will be the beginning of more things like this to share lessons, and we will see you in the streets, comrades.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.